All right, welcome back. Today what we're going to do is we're going to delve into the bird notes. Now, the other day we compared and contrasted birds with reptiles, and we saw some similarities, and then we also saw some differences as well. One of the things I mentioned to you guys is one of the unique things about birds is that they do possess feathers, and that is something unique to only birds. No other animal actually has or possesses feathers. And the other thing I mentioned is that in terms of adaptations and evolution, birds have adapted in order to be able to fly. Now, we know that not all birds do fly. However, the their body shape, some of the structure of their bones, and some of the other things that we'll see about birds is going to be similar between the birds that do fly and the birds that don't fly. Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about some of these adaptations that we see in birds. Now, because it is unique to birds, we will start with bird feathers. Okay, most bird feathers are considered to be contour feathers. Okay, and they have a few different parts to them, but if you look at the quill, okay, and then the little pieces that come off, you can see that off a feather you have these barbs, and then you also have these barbules, which are little replicas of the barbs. Okay, and then on the barbules you have these tiny little hooklets, and those hooklets act like the little hooks that we see in a zipper. So one of the things that birds will do is when they preen, and preening, basically, when you see a bird preening, what they're doing is they're taking their beak and they're kind of messing with their feathers a little bit. But one of the things they'll do when they're preening is that they're rezipping their feathers because they don't want gaps in their feathers because that would kind of hinder their flight. Okay, if you see this question here, to think about it. Okay, it asks what are birds' feathers used for? So there are many different functions. Okay, obviously they help them with flight, but they also provide some warmth or insulation, and we can even look at some things like their coloration. Okay, some of the brighter colors of the parrots and macaws, and then maybe some of the more muted colors of birds that live near the water or use their coloration for camouflage. Okay, if we look at the anatomy of a feather, there's two parts of a feather basically. There's the pennaceous or the contour feather. Now this is the tightly closed part of the feather, and the reason it is shaped the way it is it because it does create aerodynamic surface. Okay, we also have plumulaceous feathers, which are the down feathers. Okay, now these are actually wispy tufts. Okay, and for those of you who have ever had a down comforter or a down coat, the reason we purchase those things is because they do provide more warmth or insulation. However, if you ever have a feather that comes out of it, or there's a little bit of a hole in your comforter or whatever, you'll see the feathers. Generally, they're like the more wispier feathers. Okay, and so if you were to look at a bird's body, okay, the pennaceous part of the feather is further away from the bird's body. The plumulaceous or down part of their feather, which again down is used for insulation, is going to be closer to their body to keep them warm. Okay, when birds preen their feathers, and as I mentioned, they're kind of just fuss with their feathers with their beak. Okay, there's three things that happen. First of all, it helps keep them clean. Secondly, it helps them waterproof their feathers. And then thirdly, it helps them zip them back together for flight. Okay, keeping them clean is something that you guys would be familiar with. Zipping them back together for flight, we just mentioned, where those little hooklets kind of hook back together. But rubbing oil for waterproofing is important to birds. Now, not all birds have waterproof feathers, but if you think of water birds, ducks and geese and swans and things like that live pretty much, near the water all the time, obviously they want to have waterproof feathers. But even the robin that you'll see outside, when it starts raining, they would like to have waterproof feathers too. Because if you think of it, when you're outside and it's raining and it gets on your clothes, what happens? That water starts to weigh you down. Okay, birds again, everything they do is geared for flight. So they want to be able to fly. So they don't want to be weighted down by water. Okay, what feathers will do is feathers will molt, and basically they're going to lose their feathers after nesting season. Okay, feathers are dead structures, and what's interesting is in order to maintain balance, what they'll do is they'll lose their flight and tail feathers, the important feathers, in exact pairs. Okay, so that balance is always maintained. Okay, the replacement feathers will always appear before the next pair is lost. Okay, whereas many water birds, such as geese and ducks, will actually lose all their primary feathers at once, and therefore they're going to be grounded during molt. Okay, the skeletal system. We talked a little bit about the skeletal system. There are a couple typos here that I just want to point out, so I'm going to apologize in advance. But anyways, the skeletal system, they do have, this should say bird bones, by the way, they do have pneumatized bones, which are strong yet hollow. Now, when we talk about the word hollow, a lot of times people picture, oh, it's hollow like a straw. That's actually not the case. If you look at this bird bone here, okay, you can see these cross sections of bone. And what that does is that provides some strength and support to the bone. Okay, so a perfectly hollow bone would be kind of weak. Okay, if we think of a hollow bone as a straw, that would be very weak. And birds do need to have some strength to their bones. Okay, and usually the analogy I use here is when you see these bone fragments stretching across, okay, it's kind of like the support beams we have in our house. When someone builds a house, they don't just build a huge shell. Oftentimes there are walls and beams and things like that in our walls that support a lot of the rest of our house, you know, the second floor or the roof, etc. Okay, what is the advantage of hollow bones for birds? Okay, it helps them be light enough in order to fly. Okay, now the head of a bird is actually modified to function as hands. So they're going to use their head and their beak like we would use our hands. Okay, it talks about their brain case. They do have large brains. Okay, bulging eyes for great eyesight, which we'll talk about later. Okay, the teeth have been replaced by a bill in modern birds. Okay, so modern birds, the birds that we see today, do not have teeth. Okay, and they've adapted over time, and we're going to talk a little bit in a couple minutes about an ancestor of a bird and how that's changed and how their bone structure, etc., has changed over time. Okay, the muscular system. Okay, now birds are actually relatively muscular, and their flight muscles, the muscles they use for flight, must be able to meet that demand, that high energy demand that's going to be placed on them. So the largest flight muscle that we see in a bird is the pectoralis muscle, and this depresses the wings in flight. Now, pectoralis muscle, many of you are probably thinking, oh, okay, you kind of know where that is. That would be like the bird's chest muscle, okay? And you can kind of look at a bird's body structure, especially like a robin, and you can see that they have a very muscular chest, okay? And if we had the opportunity to dissect the pigeon, we would see how strong of a chest muscles that birds actually have. Okay, now when a bird perches, a lot of times we see birds sitting in a tree branch or on a power line. Okay, when they perch, they actually have a toe locking mechanism, which allows them to lock their toes around the branch or the wire, the line, and be able to sleep that way. Okay, next page very quickly. So this is the Archaeopteryx skeleton down here. This is like a ancestor of the bird. You can see that it has a very similar shape, except a couple differences. First of all, near its wings, it has these bones which are actually fused together in the modern bird, okay, to help its ability to fly. Okay, secondly, the Archaeopteryx had teeth, which birds do not have. Okay, and then also they have this long tailbone. Okay, so those are three differences between the modern bird, the crow, which we saw last week a little bit, okay, and then the Archaeopteryx, its ancestor. Okay, Lastly, the last thing I want to talk about is bird nutrition. Okay, birds have extremely high metabolisms. Okay, and so because of that, they actually need to eat a lot. Okay, so their metabolism is very high. The reason they have to take in a lot of food is to basically meet the demands of their metabolism, but also to meet their demands of flight. So they need that extra energy in order to be able to fly, because sometimes, we see birds flying, from a tree to a house or whatever in our backyards or whatever. But we'll talk later about migration and the perils of migration, and the challenges for flight and migration in birds. Okay, very quickly, a hummingbird, for example, if we look at their metabolism, they have the ability to beat their wings 80 beats per second. Okay, a robin's heart rate is 600 beats per minute. Okay, and remember that their beak and tongue are actually highly adapted for their niche or their role. Okay, it's adapted towards their diet as well. Okay, so very quickly, if we talk about the function of a hummingbird's beak, a hummingbird has a very thin beak, kind of like a syringe, okay, or like a straw. So what a hummingbird eats is it eats nectar out of flowers, okay? And so oftentimes when people buy hummingbird feeders, what they'll do is they'll buy something that has these very tiny holes, kind of like, in a flower, and then they also will buy some type of, I've seen hummingbird feeders that are kind of like shaped like flowers. And then they'll also buy some hummingbird food, which is kind of supposed to be what nectar tastes like. It's kind of like a syrupy mixture. Okay, an eagle's beak has a very hooked beak. And that hooked beak allows it to tear prey. Eagles are notorious for eating fish. They like fish. A woodpecker's beak and skull is extremely strong. Okay, and that's because they drill holes in trees in order to remove insects for food. Okay, and an interesting fun fact here, a woodpecker's beak is actually about 3 times the length of its beak. I'm sorry, a woodpecker's tongue is actually 3 times the length of its beak. And I'm going to include a picture for you guys, because actually when they retract their tongue into their body, the tongue actually kind of wraps around the skull. Okay, and I'll show you just a diagram of that. You're not going to see anything too gross. Okay, and then finally a sparrow. A sparrow eats seeds, so its beak is strong and able to crack the seeds. Okay, so next time what we'll do is we'll start in with bird digestion, and we'll talk about how their digestive system is different and how that will is one of their adaptations as well.